Hey, welcome to episode 7 of the DIY Recording Guys podcast. On this week's episode, Ben and I talk about the importance of song arrangement. We talk about the aspects of song arrangement like melody, rhythm. We talk about things like the frequency ranges of your instruments and what's important to consider there when you're doing a song arrangement. And we talk about some common song structures. This is really an often overlooked topic. We think there's going to be some kind of magic spell we can cast in the mixing phase that's going to give us all of those wonderful things we want, like width and power. But a lot of that actually comes from arranging. So enjoy.
You're listening to the DIY Recording Guys podcast, your one-stop information source for DIY music production, with your hosts, Vadim Karaz and Benjamin Hall.
All right, DIY Recording Guys, episode 7.
Here we are.
I'm Vadim Karaz from Calm Frog Recording, and with me, as always, my co-host, Benjamin Hull.
From Dream Loud Studio. Thank you guys for joining us again. What's the topic for today, Vadim?
Today's a very important topic. It's the elephant in the room, pre-production, right? It's what you need to prepare before you go into recording, right? Before you record your songs, working out all of those little details of what you're going to play, when you're going to play it, in order to build a solid song that's going to translate well into recorded material.
Yeah.
Did I summarize that?
Yeah, I think pretty good. And even more specifically, a subcategory of the pre-production is the arrangement, and that's what we're going to specifically be focusing on today. And I think maybe that word can be used interchangeably with a few different other things, but we'll be talking about, I guess we could say, 3 main different categories. First is fundamental parts of a song today. The second would be typical song structure. And the third, we're going to talk about the energy of a song and how it ebbs and flows. So I do want to give credit where credit is due. We had this idea to come up with this topic because of my friend, Jess Wegley. She asked a question on Facebook, or she posed an idea to talk about. So I'll just read her comment real quick. So she said, "Can you please talk about song arrangement in your podcast? Beat makers especially seem to lack an understanding of verse, hook, bridge, hook type format. I think producers in general can greatly benefit from knowing standard songwriting arrangements and how to bring out the best of each section." I think that's a super great point, because even if you wouldn't consider yourself a producer, and let's say you're recording your own songs or recording your own band, somebody in your group or external to your group is going to have to take that role of producer, even if it's not formally mentioned. But the producer's role is basically to structure the song and make sure that from a high level that the song sounds good. Would you agree with that, Vadim? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, any number of people can play that producer role. And I do want to speak to myself, my teenage self here, when I used to think that, something like song structure or, learning about typical arrangements was kind of like, what do you mean? I'm writing my own songs here. I don't need any help writing my highly mediocre songs. I can do it all on my own. And it took me a long time to realize that really these things, like traditional song structures, are tools. They're tools in your toolbox that can help you when you get stuck. You're still writing your songs, but if you get stuck and you're like, oh, I'm not really sure, this chorus doesn't really hit hard enough, going to these kind of your toolbox and pulling out something that's maybe been used successfully before is a great option. So that's really one of the big things we'll be talking about today.
Can't agree more. And I think a big thing to keep in mind too, being DIY people trying to do all this stuff ourselves, I can totally relate to that young teenage arrogance of wanting to do everything on your own. And you think, I think at least for me, I'd look up to my heroes, whatever rock bands I was into, and have the illusion that these guys are doing everything themselves. I can do everything myself. And a lot of times it wasn't true at all. A lot of those artists that I looked up to had whole teams of people helping them write and produce. I mean, I wasn't even aware of what a producer was back then. And for most of my teenage years, I would say the Red Hot Chili Peppers were my favorite band. And just understanding how important the role of a producer comes in there, those guys probably could have never wrote a pop song that appealed to a large swath of people without a producer helping them, because they were essentially just a jam band. And the reason I bring all this up is just to say, not to be so hard on yourself or so arrogant to try to take on all of these different roles yourself, or not look to some outside help, because each area, when it comes to either recording or songwriting or just being a musician, I mean, that takes its own 10,000 hours just to be excellent at, right?
Yeah. Well, where do you want to start, Ben? Go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to dive in first with the fundamental parts of a song. This is up for debate, but I found a pretty handy guide on the internet that broke it down into 5 different categories. So we'll just go with that and maybe talk about how these categories are a little bit fluid. Maybe you could break them down into less categories or more. But the first one that I found was rhythm. So that would be percussion, drums, and some melodic instruments. 2, melody, whatever is the part that makes you want to sing to or hum to in a song. I would consider the melody.
Yeah, it's the part if somebody said, how does that song go?
Yeah.
It's the part you would sing, right? That's the melody. Even if in an instrumental song, you could hum it or whatever.
Exactly.
That would be the melody, yeah.
3 would be harmony, and all the harmony is basically other melodies along with the melody. They are simultaneous notes along with your melody that form a chord, which I guess a chord would be 2 or more notes. Am I right in saying that? Yeah, I guess so, because power chords are 2 notes.
Yeah.
Essentially.
They're the greatest of all chords.
They are the greatest. Oh my gosh. I take a lot of this stuff for granted, and that's another caveat I wanted to say diving into all of this is a lot of this stuff I just picked up from osmosis from listening and playing a lot of music. I didn't sit down with, a textbook and study all this stuff, but it is helpful to think about it in a little bit more of a studious way, because you can kind of reverse engineer and pick apart, why does this famous song work so much as a song structure? Or why does this song structure happen a lot of times? Or why is there always seem to be a rhythm guitar, a lead guitar, a bass guitar in most popular rock songs?
Yeah, that is really interesting. I do often think about that, like how we settled on these conventions, but they do seem to work well.
Mm-hmm.
In Western, certainly this doesn't apply to music around the world, but in Western music, certainly 4/4 tends to be the dominant meter. So you have 4 beats to a measure and a quarter note per beat. A quarter note gets the beat. There's a lot of different, it's basically just a way to subdivide how you count the rhythm of a song. So like we talked about with melody, if I asked you to sing a song, you would sing the melody. If I asked you to tap out or count a song, you'd be probably counting or tapping out the meter. Actually, I wanted to ask you, Ben, when growing up learning to play, did you read music?
Yes, I did. Not very well, because I'm much more my ear is pretty good, at least for mimicking stuff. I don't have perfect pitch or anything like that, but if you played something for me, I could pretty quickly figure it out and play it back. So that was always my...
On bass, specifically?
On pretty much anything.
Yeah?
My ear's just pretty decent when it comes to that kind of a thing. The good side of that is, it makes it quick to learn songs. The downside of that is I would always, even though my mom taught me to read music, I would rely on that skill a lot more than reading. You know what I mean? So my reading was never really that good, but...
You faked it, basically. You were faking it.
Yeah, I faked
People
it a lot.
would put sheet music in front of you, and then you would just listen and just pick it out, and then pretend you were reading. I got you, man. I played that game. I took piano lessons. I'm hip to it.
Yeah, of course.
My ear was not good, but what I would do when I was a kid was just watch my piano teacher's hands.
Really?
And then just mimic that. Yeah, and for some reason that worked for me, and I cheated my way out of a good music education. So I have that.
That's amazing, man. Well, it's interesting.
Yeah.
I think it's so interesting to see the different ways people learn. I'm much more auditory. And it's interesting.
Which is good because music is auditory.
Right. Really, music notation is the best way to visually put it into a time meter or a measure so that somebody else can repeat it back. Because, sometimes I've done those cover gigs where you just get 40 sheets of chord symbols over the lyrics. And if you don't know the song, I mean, every single song is basically going to sound the same, right? It's because you have no idea what the rhythm is supposed to sound like or any groove. So that's why
that's a good point.
That's why meter's important.
Yeah. Sheet music is definitely a richer medium for transferring information on a song than tabs. It's just so freaking annoying to me always like the way the key changes are handled, right? And actually, have you ever, this is we can cut this out because it's way off topic, but have you heard of like Nashville notation?
Yeah.
Yeah, where everything's kind of based off of the one. It seems I haven't actually looked at it that much, but sheet music. I don't know. It definitely has a lot of information, but there's such a barrier to learning it. At least there was for me. And once I learned it on piano, I never took the time to learn it on guitar, which became my main instrument. But anyway, so back to song structure. I think you were talking about meter, right?
Yeah, I was talking about fundamental parts of a song. So that was the fourth one, meter, and the fifth one would be the key. So that was the high level. Okay, and let's dive in a little bit more now. So the first part of the song, rhythm, I think this is my favorite part, even though I'm a bass player, but I tell people all the time I play bass like a drummer. I just love messing around with rhythms. It's where the groove is. To me, it's the most fun part of a song. If you hear a song that really makes you want to tap your foot, it's probably because of the rhythm. I spend a lot of time focusing on the rhythm, making sure it's good. What can we say about this? Like, the rhythm can come from a variety of different sources. It doesn't have to just be the drums. It can be a percussion instrument. It can even be another melodic instrument. It can be the bass guitar at times, especially in funk music. In jazz, a lot of the times, the bass guitar is keeping more of the rhythm than even the drums are, which is kind of reversed and backwards to thinking, but it's definitely true. In singer-songwriter genres or indie music, you'll have acoustic guitar and maybe even mandolin that's kind of strumming and keeping the beat. So a lot of different sources that rhythm can come from. It's important to think about and note what kind of a feel do you want from the song. Do you want it to be really punchy and in your face? Then you probably want all the instruments to be hitting at the same time.
There's something that I kind of had to learn the hard way. When I started, I do a lot of like prog metal and prog rock, and that's what I started out doing because I started out writing that kind of music. And my initial instinct was get the guitar to kind of just sound as brutal and mean as possible. And I was like, I don't even need a bass guitar. I'm just gonna make my low end really chug on the guitar, and then I'm just gonna have the drums, and it's gonna be fine. And through the course of playing around with this stuff, what I came to realize was that, at least for rock, like hard rock, that power can't be generated by one instrument. It really comes from the entire range of the frequency spectrum kind of hitting you at once. Mm-hmm. And different instruments have different parts of the frequency spectrum that they are kind of good at, let's say. So like a kick drum covers that really low 60 hertz kind of bass that hits you in the chest range. If you've ever seen like a live show, when they're doing sound check and that kick drum is going, you could kind of feel it in your chest. The bass covers a lot of the rest of that low end up to where the guitars take over and kind of the mid range. And then the cymbals kind of are the sparkly thing at the very top. So if you hit all those instruments hit at the same time, kick drum, a bass note, a guitar chord, and a cymbal, that's the whole frequency spectrum hitting you in the face. And so when you talk about coming up with rhythm sections, you want to consider those types of things. You can have cool sections and cool instruments playing off of each other, but if you're going for like that power, that tightness, yeah, having those instruments coordinate is really important, especially in the rhythm section.
I think I probably use a lot of Red Hot Chili Pepper examples in this episode. I'll try not to,
yeah.
But I think they do this in a lot of their songs. And if any of you are fans of the Red Hot Chili Peppers or have heard some of their songs, maybe it'll pop right into your head what I'm talking about. And if you haven't, maybe it's worth going to check out some of their more popular upbeat songs. But a lot of times what they'll do is in verses, sometimes all three instrumentalists are playing different rhythms. And then in the chorus, they'll all come together on the same rhythm. And it kind of gives... So the verses are more kind of like this, there's this cool polyrhythmic stuff happening. Because there's nothing wrong with doing that. You don't have to play the same rhythms.
Sure.
Sometimes playing different rhythms together can create the illusion of like a third new type of rhythm that evolves from that, which I love that kind of stuff. But you can't keep that up for a full song because it just gets a little bit too, I feel like it's too exhaustive to the listener to listen to just so much craziness all the time. So they'll do that for a few bars in the verses, and then in the chorus, they're all together playing the chorus rhythm. And it creates this cool contrast between maybe more mellow part with a more in-your-face punchy part. So that's definitely a cool thing you could do.
That's a nice foreshadow into the last section we're going to talk about today, which we'll get to with energy flow and how kind of energy moves through a song. But that's a great way of... I'll give you the 2-word summary of that whole section is tension and release, right? 3-word summary. So that's a great way to have a little bit of tension and then have some release in the chorus to, as listeners, that's kind of that's what pulls our, our heartstrings, so to speak. That's what kind of gets us going. So, yeah.
I don't think I have too much to say about melody, the second fundamental part of a song. Other than... I think sometimes it can be useful to have a keyboard handy or even a MIDI controller. And if something, the two scenarios I can think of are maybe as a vocalist, let's just say you're writing your own song, because I have this problem a lot where I feel like my vocals are too stale or they sound too same-ish, or I'll wind up singing the same intervals or melody patterns a lot of the time. So it's just nice to have a keyboard handy where I can maybe experiment around with some different intervals that maybe I wouldn't try naturally just singing them. So that can be a way to experiment around and figure out different things. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's such a great point, is that you may have more freedom on something like a keyboard to play around and try different things. The other thing, I even use my guitar sometimes. My wife is actually a really good singer, and one thing I learned, this is a cautionary bit, but I used to write a lot of vocal lines for her on the guitar. I had to kind of band myself on her range. So I had to know where on my guitar her vocal range was, where she was strongest and where she was maybe reaching. I had to do that in order to write lines that she could sing. But yeah, having that keyboard or whatever instrument you're most comfortable with and writing a melody using that instrument is a great way to improve your creativity. Because I don't sing at all, but when I try to come up with vocal line singing, I do inevitably sing like the same two things.
Yeah.
It's either song A or song B is what I have.
I'm kind of the same. I'm way better at helping somebody else that already has a good idea come up with an even better idea. It's so hard for me from scratch, though. I'm getting better though.
And that's actually leads into maybe the next thing on harmony.
Yeah.
This is the other place where I have a little MIDI controller on my desk. I do this all the time in sessions. When we're done recording the main vocal track, I will pick out the parts for the main vocal track on the keyboard just using a synth or something like that. And then seeing them on the keyboard, I can then come up with a harmony part. A lot of times singers have a hard time. They're so used to the main melody it's hard for them to even envision a harmony kind of organically. But I can play it on the synth and be like, this is going to be a cool harmony. They can then learn that by listening to the synth.
That's a great
and
point.
Then we can record vocal takes of those harmonies.
That's a great point, and maybe even another note on recording vocal harmonies. I feel like you just can't ever have too many vocal harmonies, and this is a personal preference of mine, but a lot of times a vocal sounds huge in a chorus because there's so many layered harmonies, like an absurd amount of layered harmonies that are just kind of buried back behind the main vocal. And I didn't realize it until I started recording a lot more and listening a lot more intensely to other professional made mixes and realizing, dang, there are like probably 5 to 12 layers of vocals in here. So don't be afraid of putting in even weird harmonies sometimes, because you can always bury them.
I had the same exact epiphany where in pop songs, I couldn't get a vocal to sound kind of big enough. And the analogy here to rock, which I'm more used to, is that it would be like playing a single note on a guitar and trying, for those really heavy parts. Like, no, you need the power chord.
Right.
Well, in pop music, that's exactly what's happening in those pop productions. They have the main vocal coming down the middle, and then all of these harmonies, like you said, it can be, 8, 10 layers of doubles coming from the sides, and they're kind of buried, but it gives this powerful vocal sound that we're all used to hearing in pop music.
Yeah, exactly. I think one thing to keep in mind is, especially from an arrangement perspective, and I think rock guys kind of have a step up on this because it's already pretty much a sign that you're going to need to write a rock song. You need a drummer, a bass player, a guitarist, and a vocalist. And because that's already been kind of figured out and decided that that's a really good format for a rock song, a lot of people that want to form rock bands don't have to think about, well, what instruments do I need to fill up the frequency spectrum? But when I started experimenting around with electronic music, all of a sudden I realized I didn't really know what I was doing as far as filling up the frequency spectrum, because all I had was just example of bass synths, and I was just started stacking them. And so in some of my initial electronic productions, I would just have like 20 different bass synths stacked on top of each other because I was going for that really big and loud electronic or EDM sound, and I couldn't figure out, I have so many bass synths in here. How come I'm not getting it? But that was a really
more bass synths,
exactly,
more.
Yeah. But that was a really big epiphany for me, and what I realized is that what I was trying to find was this combination of bass instruments, mid instruments, and treble instruments that all work together and kind of all fill up the frequency range spectrum in a way so that they're kind of all hitting you at the same time. And that's such an important thing, I think, for people that aren't doing traditional rock and roll to think about.
Yeah, that's a great point. And as in the mix, as mix engineers, we often think about that piece of information in terms of frequencies, where we use equalizers to help certain things cut through the mix. But it's really even important in this pre-production and arrangement stage where, for example, if you have like a keyboard player and a guitarist and they're playing in the same register, they may be stepping on each other, and it may be hard to get those two instruments to be distinguished. So shifting the keyboard up an octave, for example, or something like that, can all of a sudden you can hear both the guitar and the keyboard. Those are the little types of things that are really worth thinking about before you hit record.
Yeah, there's this one band that I'm really a big fan of. I'd call them indie electronic, but they have, it's a rock band, but they have an electronic sound to them. Their name is Joywave, and they do a lot of unique stuff with the guitar and keyboard in particular, because in some songs, the keys can take more a role of the bass guitar. In other songs, the keys are the rhythm and the guitar player is only doing a lead. And it was a little bit mind-bending to me to kind of see them pull that off live, because you just assume if you have one guitar player in a band, they're going to be playing rhythm guitar and holding big chords. But a lot of times he wasn't doing that. A lot of times the guitar player was playing like a cool lead or a cool lick, and he was relying on the keyboard player with a heavy amount of distortion to kind of fill up everything.
That reminds me of, I'm assuming you've seen Spinal Tap.
Yeah.
Yeah, when who was it? David St. Hubbins leaves the band, and they ask the keyboard player if he could cover his part, and he says, "Well, I have two hands, don't I?" So, yeah, yeah, definitely. That's a really good point, and framing it in the context of, like you said, with what part of the frequency spectrum is this instrument responsible for, is a good way of thinking about it. Because for rock it's easy, we're all used to those rock instruments. For other types of music, you can frame it slightly differently and get a similar result.
Yeah.
Cool.
All right.
What's next?
So maybe just a quick note on meter. So that's the subdivisions of the music. And I guess the biggest question is, why do we care about this at all? Because most music is in 4/4. Do I really need to think about this at all? And sometimes it's easier to feel a song out if you could subdivide it in a different way. Like, for example, if you're playing a shuffle beat or something that has a swing feel to it, 6/8 time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I've seen drummers count off a song in 4/4. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then start playing in 6/8. And it's just really confusing. And I think it can break up the feeling and not allow all the instruments to play with the same groove.
Yeah, I am guilty of that. I like to count everything off in 4. even though almost none of the stuff that I personally play and a lot of the bands I work with, a lot of it is not in 4/4. It's just a convenient way.
Devil's advocate then, so how do you get away with it? I'm curious.
Well, yeah, I mean you're operating on the premise that everybody kind of knows the song and knows what they're doing.
Gotcha.
So it's just a 1, 2, 3, 4 is just kind of like the classic way to count things off. But even like I find for me, I write a lot of odd meter stuff in my spare time. I'll often write riffs in 4/4 because it just feels so natural. It's so ingrained in us. And then I'll mess around with it. I'll add a beat and make it 5/4 or something like that. So even in pop music, I mean, there's a lot of songs out there that are an odd meter that you probably don't realize are an odd meter. It can be done. Like I think it's like "Fell on Black Days" by Soundgarden was a pretty popular
that's
song.
a good one.
That's an odd meter song. Spoon Man, a lot of the songs on that album actually. But like Possum Kingdom, if you remember that old 90s song, I think that was in some like 7/8 or something. So you can do it. I mean, don't lock yourself into 4/4. Sometimes you can get really interesting grooves playing around with odd meters too. I promise that's the only math rock pitch I'll throw in here for this episode.
Yeah. I think another thing too, well, the reason that probably most songs are in 4/4 is because it feels the best to humans. And you can leverage the other meters if you want people to feel uncomfortable. And the one song that comes to mind is actually, if you've seen the movie Lord of the Rings, I think it's Mordor. The Mordor theme is in 5/4 because the drums go bump 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 bump, and that's
no way.
It's a 5/4 measure, and because it doesn't repeat on on an even number, it gives you this uneasy feeling. So if you want people to feel uneasy, that's kind of a way you can go about it.
That's a really interesting point. Also, Mordor was super metal for sure.
Oh,
but, yeah. But that's a really interesting point, Ben. I never thought about that, but you can totally use that. Yeah, an odd meter to build some of that tension before going into something a little more familiar. That's really interesting.
Yeah. Okay. So the last fundamental part of the song that we have is the key. So I guess the most obvious question is, how do you go about picking a key? And I think I'd subdivide this into two different categories. So, one, do you have a vocalist? If you have a vocalist, you should probably pick a key that your vocalist can sing in.
Yeah.
For sure. And if you don't know what key your vocalist can sing in, sit down with them and play along and see if they can actually hit the notes or not, because you're just gonna make it harder for everybody if your vocalist can't actually sing to it. That's the first thing. If you don't have a vocalist or you're not worried about that, pick a key that makes the most sense for the instruments to play in. You know, I've seen a lot of bands pick arbitrary keys or just pick. The one thing that actually I ran into with my old band Big Atlantic is we wrote a 10-song album, and I think we had 5 different keys. So 2 songs per key, and they sounded great and we recorded them. The thing we didn't think about, though, was when we went to play them live, that meant we needed 5 different guitars, each of us, to play these songs. So that's another thing to think about. You know, sometimes it's just easier to pick all the same key if you're at least in the same area of the guitar. And what I'm talking about is, you know, D major versus D flat or D sharp.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. And even with arranging in general, it's something to, you know, your live act is something to consider. If that's part of what you want to do as a musician is perform live, you do need to consider what you can and can't do. So like you may have an awesome vocal harmony that your singer sings twice, and if they can't do that live, you're going to have to make a decision there. If it's an integral part of the song, then you may be in trouble. So I always err on the side of, you know, making the recording sound as good as it possibly can and do what serves the recording. But I am sensitive to the fact that, like, you know, you got to consider your live act and what you can pull off and how you're going to do it.
Yeah, totally agree. Well, that took a lot longer to cover than I realized. So
yeah, we'll cut a bunch of it. Don't worry.
Okay, all good. The next thing we wanted to talk about was typical song structure, and you could subdivide a song into most songs into 6 different parts, and maybe I'd even say 7. So a lot of songs have an intro. You'll have a verse portion. Some songs have a pre-chorus. Other songs go straight into the chorus after the verse. Then you'll have a chorus, which is normally the biggest part of the song. And some songs have what I like to call a hook. I'm a huge fan of a hook. And a lot of times the hook comes in the intro, but very sparsely. It's really subdued. And then the hook is the instrumental part that happens after a chorus. I love doing that whenever I'm producing or writing a song. Another part of a song is the bridge. That's the other part. That's the part of the song where you do something related to the chorus or verse, maybe done in a different way, maybe with different chords, but it's the part that switches it up. And then a lot of times you'll have a chorus and then an outro. So I guess we could just talk about that real quick. I know, Vadim, you're working a lot more in prog rock. How much do you think about these parts of the song?
Well, let's say I think about more where the song is going and how it feels. So I'm blessed / cursed with a very short attention span. So a lot of times I'll be listening to a song and I can just, you know, if I can just kind of feel when the energy seems to be dragging a little bit. I am sensitive definitely to different parts of a song, but as far as like what goes where, it's more of how does it feel, and am I keeping the listener's attention engaged throughout the song, which is really the key.
Yeah. I think another way you can look at these parts of the song too, especially from a vocalist perspective, is how do each of these parts help you tell a story? Because each song, even if it's instrumental, it's the point of it is to convey a message or tell a story. So I think a lot of times your chorus is kind of the thesis. It's what your song is about. It's the main idea. And a lot of times the verses are kind of just the explanation of what the chorus is about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that exactly. It ties into what we said with tension and release. So a lot of times you can use these different sections to build to the chorus, which is kind of like the big release, right? A lot of times. So, but what you're saying is more even in terms of lyrics. It's you're telling, you have a narrative that you're kind of following, and the narrative has to make sense. Just like when you're telling a story, the narrative has to make sense and follow a certain arc, right?
Yeah. Exactly. And I think you're going to see that in pretty much every pop song. It's going to make sense. It's going to tell a story. It's not going to be random. So it's something worth thinking about for sure. Okay, so with that being said, I found 5 different major song structure types. So we'll talk about them briefly. And we'll talk about how we never use any of them except for one. but the 5 different main song structure types are, and they divide this into each letter is a different section type. So the first one is AABA. And the most recognizable example of that is Over the Rainbow, which is crazy. I never would have thought about it until I saw that example and I realized, oh, it is true. There is a B section, which is a bridge because it's all verse and then there's a bridge.
I got to think about that. Yeah, I don't even know how it goes. You want to sing it?
No. I don't want to try.
That's a tough one. That's a tough one.
I could do the main part, but the bridge is a little bit hard because it bounces back and forth, I think, in a second interval, which is really hard to do, so I'm not going to try. I'm not a vocalist. I never claimed to be. The second type of song structure is ABAB. And a lot of these kind of songs come from the big band swing era. So Fly Me to the Moon by Frank Sinatra is an example of that. So there's a first section and a second section, and it repeats. And I have played a few of those songs, but I'm not super familiar. That's not what I listen to, and it's not what I write. And I don't think there are too many pop songs that take that format. And you feel free to chime in if you have different examples, Vadim, of any of these.
Well, one of the examples I'm going to play is actually, it's ABAB CB or something like that. So there's an ABAB section to it, kind of like a main riff and a verse. But yeah, keep going.
Yeah, so that was the next one I actually was going to mention is the ABABCB. And that is pretty much every single pop song. I'd say 90% of modern music takes that structure.
Okay.
And because that's basically verse, chorus, bridge, chorus. And there are slight different variations that you can do to that. Like you can add pre-choruses in, or what I like to call hooks, which are post-chorus, or outros, but it's all essentially that song form. The next one is ABA, which is the most recognizable example of that, although it's barely a song, is Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. So as you can see, like I'm really reaching for the stars to find examples, but it's just because
no pun intended, right?
Yeah, no pun. Well, that very much was intended, cheesily intended. And then the fifth different song structure is just simply AAA, and this is a lot of traditional songs, like Amazing Grace or hymns of that nature. It's just one verse that just repeats, and that's more of, I think, maybe religious music or something that's heavily lyric based.
Okay.
I mean, with all of these song structures, the point is you're finding the balance between something that's repeatable that your listener can latch onto. So repeatable parts without being boring, I think, is the point. Because there's no way you could write an AAA song structure and have the same lyrics over and over and over again.
Right.
Like that's just
like
a nightmare.
Row your boat type of thing, yeah.
Yes, exactly. So it's interesting to me that I think if you would research and look up, well, what songs have that AAA song structure, they're probably going to be the most lyrically complicated. Probably very few repeating phrases or words, in fact, because the music is so repetitive.
Right.
Whereas
Right. It's almost like the music is just a vessel for
exactly
the poem or the words. Yeah.
And then in some of these other song structures, you might have really similar parts, but the chords are changing underneath. The sections are changing. So that's where the interest is kind of placed into the song. So that's like the 5 major different ones, and I wanted to add another one to that category because Vadim and I both work and play in those genres, but that would be a linear song structure, which basically means anything goes. And you find this a lot in, I don't know if you find it in any pop music, but you definitely find it in prog rock. Just random key changes, random meter changes, random rhythm changes, and not a lot of repeating parts.
Yeah. There's a lot of. I'm trying to think like probably the closest thing in pop. Well, this is more popular back in the day with like King Crimson and Yes. They had some very kind of linear song structures where songs would just kind of evolve and change. Also, like some of those Yes songs were like 17 minutes long.
Yeah, crazy.
And but yeah, that's it's challenging. I mean, it's challenging just to keep people's attention, but it can be done if if you still pay attention to where it's going and where it's been.
As you were saying that, I can't think of the specific examples, but I know I've heard some modern songs where they'll have like maybe it's even a verse chorus type of thing happening, and then the second half of the song is something completely different.
Yeah, that's one of the ones I wanted to talk about as an example for the next section. Actually, sort of does
cool.
that. It's that Billie Eilish song, "Bad Guy."
Oh, "Bad Guy's" a cool song. Yeah,
which is a very cool song. And there's that whole. I wrote out that it's kind of like AABC, AABC, and then there's that like filthy trap section at the end, which is awesome. And that's like that's not something you hear a lot, but that's a really popular song that has a totally different section at the end that comes out of nowhere. It's great. It's really kind of refreshing, I think.
That's cool. Very cool. Well, this might be the perfect point to transition over to you, because that's all I had to say about song structure. So take it away with the third part of this podcast.
Yeah, the third section is very much tied to what we just talked about. It's how you arrange those, what you can do with those different song structure segments in order to keep the listener engaged. So if you think about like I said, I have a very short attention span. Modern listeners have very short attention spans. If you watch like a movie trailer, it's constantly changing camera angles and camera scenes. It's to constantly keep you engaged. And this is kind of what we're trying to do when we're arranging our song. And I wanted to actually read this short little quote I have from a book. It's a book by Mike Senior. He's from Sound on Sound. It's a great book called Mixing Secrets for the Small Studio. I actually highly recommend it. I think it's probably the best book I've seen on mixing. But he talks about this in the context of mixing, but it's equally applicable in the context of arranging. And what he says is, this is a quote now, in a lot of cases in commercial music, you want to have enough repetition in the arrangement that the music is easily comprehensible to the general public, but you also want to continually demand renewed attention by varying the arrangement slightly in each section, as well as giving some sense of an emotional buildup through the entire production. So I think that's kind of a really nice way of putting it. And the way I like to think about this is if you this is like maybe a little too mathematical, but if you think of a graph, like you think of the horizontal part of a graph as being like time. So, from when the song starts, as you progress through the song, you have these different sections. And then the vertical part of the graph, the y-axis, is like the energy, right? And what you don't want to have is a flat line, because very quickly that gets tedious. If you come in, you start your song with just a shredding guitar solo, and then you just continue shredding for like the next 4 minutes, people are going to get bored, because you're only going to be they're only going to be shocked and impressed for that first split second.
That's true.
Right? And then you kind of get accustomed to it. So even with all of these different song structures, like let's say the one that you mentioned, Ben, A, B, A, B, C, B, right? You don't want to have all of those A's be identical, because the first time you play an A section, it's novel and people are interested. Then they have the chorus, presumably the B part, right? Then you can go back to that A part. If they've heard it before, you're losing them, right? They're instantly their attention dwindles. So you have to think about what can you do to make that section more interesting. And there's kind of two ways to approach this. You can just add little components to kind of spice up that energy. And it's a very subtle change can make a big difference. So for example, if you've recorded like something like an egg shaker throughout, you could record that egg shaker throughout the whole song, and then just pick sections like, okay, the first verse didn't have an egg shaker. We're going to add it to the second verse. And just it's just going to add that little bit of sizzle and energy to keep people engaged. So a good way to kind of think about this when you're arranging your song is to record it like on your cell phone or wherever, just on your main instrument, record it the way you have it. Then sit down with like a pen and paper and listen to it through the lens of a listener and just see where your attention starts to wane a little bit. And where it does, it may be time to add some elements or take something away. So, and even like you can get really formal with this where you can like list the elements in your busiest riff. Let's say your chorus riff, you have a kick, a snare, an open hi-hat, a bass guitar, all these different elements. You can list those elements out, write them out, and then make columns for each of the song sections. So here's my verse section, here's my chorus section, then I go back to the verse. And for each of those columns, you can indicate kind of visually which instruments will be playing and which instruments will not be playing. And sometimes just doing this exercise visually, you can see like, oh, okay, no, my verse 1 is too busy. There's nowhere to build from there. Right. Or so it's kind of a nice way to visualize your song.
That was really well said. A lot of the time, I even think about taking away elements to add interest. And that can kind of be, it's interesting how sometimes taking away elements can add more energy or add more excitement. But one of my favorite things to do is to drop out, like in the second verse, I'll drop out the guitars, and then all of a sudden you just have a vocal naked with the percussion and maybe the bass guitar, especially if the bass guitar is doing something really cool. And a lot of times just kind of peeling back that curtain, I don't know if it's like the tribalness of just hearing drums with vocals just elicits some kind of like caveman response from us, but I feel that a lot of times because sometimes those mid-range instruments, whether it's keys or guitar, like I like them as much as anybody else, but they can kind of mask what's happening underneath. And all of a sudden, whenever you pull them away, then you just have the naked rhythm, and even that, and sometimes can influence a little bit interesting change of rhythm in the song. So maybe for one example, let's just say you have a kick drum that's just pounding boom, 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 but you have a bass guitar part that's kind of like bum, 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 da 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 da. So it's something a little bit more syncopated. Now let's say you drop out the kick drum all of a sudden in the second verse. Now you don't have those quarter notes going. Instead, you have only the bass guitar to hold the rhythm, and it's going to make your listeners say, oh, wait, that's a really cool rhythm that I didn't hear before. So those are the things that pop into my mind.
Yeah, you read my mind, actually. I was going to talk about taking things away, and that is a really wonderful technique. A good way to think about this is like, you want to have those step changes in energy. That's really when people are, like the most kind of say, like, I know I probably overuse analogies, but like the Dunkin' Donuts sugar donut version of this is like, like the Harlem Shake, like a song like that, where like it's very obvious what's happening, it's very formulaic, and it's still so satisfying, right? It's like where you take a lot of things away, and people know it's coming because they've already heard the drop, but you take even more away. You strip down the production even further. Then when it comes back, it's even more satisfying. And what that is, kind of visually, is a step change in energy. And this is what you mentioned is a great way of doing it, because early in the song, you want to capture people's attention right away. So you may have a really rockin' first verse, and then escalate for the chorus. Now, when the second chorus hits, you want that chorus to hit even harder, so you can strip down the second verse. Now you've taken more elements away, and then later when you bring them back, it's that big step change in energy. You want to get a couple of those. I forget, there's some like conventional wisdom on like 2 or 3 big drops like that, in a song.
I agree with that.
A great example of a great example of that in like a famous song, and this is actually something that's, you kind of hinted at this. A lot of modern songs are using they're doing a pre-chorus, they're using a pre-chorus in a bridge. So the bridge section is like a very stripped down pre-chorus. A good example of that is like the Weeknd song "Can't Feel My Face," which is like a huge hit, right? If you listen to that, the bridge is a really, really stripped back pre-chorus, and he's singing an octave lower that really brings the energy down. And then the last chorus that hits is like the most massive chorus. So you get this epic step change in energy, and it's really satisfying.
Yeah, one thing that's not really used too much anymore is a key change too, to change energy.
Yeah, like Man in the Mirror, the Michael Jackson song.
That used to be, I mean, probably in the 80s, like pretty much every song like had a key change.
Yeah, and what is it like? It would be the last chorus. You would do the key change up to.
Yeah, normally a whole step, I would say. Which could be a cool technique. There are modern songs that do that. I just think it became so cliche that people stayed away from it, I think.
I know, but it's so funny because like I think there's some Beyonce songs that do that, but it's so like when you're at a wedding or something, right? And you have those songs with the key change, everybody just lights up with that key change.
Oh yeah.
So that'd be, Ben, let's bring back the key change.
Let's do it, man.
Let's do it.
Except because we're in metal, it would be a key drop.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. I love it. Just drop a whole step. You got to tune during the song.
Yeah.
Maybe during the drum solo.
Oh my gosh.
That's awesome. Yeah, so that song I wanted to mention, that Billie Eilish song, I was listening to it. It's a really simple song. There's not a lot of elements to it, and so it's really easy to hear what's happening. Where like there's a verse that's very minimal, and then they just add some snaps and a couple of vocal harmonies. You can listen to that. Just go listen to it and just see what they're doing with bringing elements in and then taking them away. And actually it does exactly what you said, where like I think the second verse is a really stripped down verse, which is really cool. I think it's like just vocals, claps, and snaps. And it's really kind of a nice effect.
That's very cool.
Check that out.
I remember feeling the same way when I first heard that song "Royals" by Lorde. And my first impression was there's nothing in this song. It's just vocal and kick drum. But if you go back and listen to it, there's actually a whole ton of harmony happening, but it's all in the vocal harmonies. Massive amounts of vocal harmonies. And her vocals are kind of taking the place of all of what traditional instruments would take, which is a cool approach to it too.
That's the other example I wrote down, actually. I totally agree with you. Listen to that. It's like it's a kick, some snaps, a little bit of synth, and then just vocals. And it's a really well-produced song, I think.
So yeah, how can our listeners apply this to their own music? And I think one of the most obvious things is, especially if you're in a band, it's important to recognize that just because you're playing an instrument in a band doesn't mean you have to play the whole time. Don't have to play the whole song. You don't. It is funny to say it that way, but like I'm talking to my teenage self as well. Like I wanted to sometimes, and this would be called overplaying, but I would play during the quietest parts of the song where it was just supposed to be like a vocal whisper, and I'd be up high on my bass doing some weird thing, and I thought I was so cool. But what would have been even cooler than that would be not playing at all.
That's big of you. That's big of you to admit that.
Well, thanks, but it does make a big difference. And I think I think honestly a lot of times what happens in rock bands is that you feel awkward if you're on stage, especially performing, and you're just not playing anything. But I think it's okay to, don't be self-conscious about that. Like the band is carrying you, Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And in the studio, you have even more flexibility there, right? You have even less of a need for everybody to be playing
right
at the same time. So definitely consider that in your arrangements.
As far as in the studio, I think it's a lot easier. But if you can convince your band or think of writing in that way where let's add parts, and that might not be for every song. Like in some songs, maybe everybody is playing the whole way through, but just that it doesn't have to be that way. Is, I think, sometimes a really eye-opening realization to have.
Yeah, agreed. And as far as preparing to record, I do recommend writing things out. Writing almost like a comp sheet, where you have the song sections listed and what's happening in each song section. It can really be a nice way to focus everyone for one thing. And for another thing, it's a nice checklist then to make sure you've recorded everything you were intending to record.
Yeah, good point. Did you have anything else to talk about when it comes to energy?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. How about you?
I think so. The one little outlier comment that I wanted to mention was just song length. And interestingly enough, for most of recorded music history, the average song length has been between 3 to 5 minutes.
Really?
Consistently. And there have been a lot of songs that have been way longer than that, but it's pretty much universal that really popular songs, and especially songs that are on the radio, are in that 3 to 5 minute range. And if you want to be on the radio, which, I mean, that's a high order to get on nationally played radio is very hard to do. But if your song is over 4 minutes, they'll cut it.
Yeah, that's, and tell me if you recall this the way I recall it, but I remember in the 90s, songs were longer. I remember rock songs like Alice in Chains or whatever, I feel like were 5.5 minutes long, but now it seems long, right? Nowadays songs are shorter than that.
Yeah, I half agree, and also I also at the same time remember a lot of radio edited songs that I didn't even know were radio edited because I heard them on the radio first, and then I got the album and I was like there's a lot of Rage songs like Killing in the Name has a huge long bridge that's not in there. I know some Korn songs were cut.
That's a good point, yeah.
But they were done in such a creative way that the radio station's basically being the producer at that point. You don't need that part of the song.
That's interesting. Do you think the radio stations were doing that, or were the bands providing
no
radio edited material?
I think that was probably, the radio stations work heavily with the record labels. So I think that was probably a record label executive decision and not just a radio station cutting it.
Yeah, because there was even cases where they would edit they would replace bad words with less bad words that could be said on the radio, but it was clearly the singer doing it. So I assume that all those decisions were made in post-production or whatever before the band left the studio.
I guess the last argument when it comes to that is, are the radio stations and record labels bad for doing that, or do they? I mean, partially because it kind of sucks to. If you're a fan of Rage Against the Machine, you want to hear the full Rage song. But at the same time, I can't deny that they understand human psychology of listening to an interesting song, and they realize we don't really need this whole extended part of this song in here.
F you, I don't care what you tell me or whatever. Yeah, that, I had the same experience with that. I remember
really?
I bought that cassette and I was like, I actually thought I'm not in favor in general of editing music. But that song seemed too long to me after I listened to it on the record. I was like, the bridge is a little long.
Yeah. So well said. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. It was a lot of fun to do. And if you have any other arrangement questions, please reach out to us on our Facebook community, the DIY Guys recording or DIY Recording Guys community. I always mess that up.
Take care, guys, and we remind you to check yourself
before you wreck yourself. Take care. We'll see ya.
If you're enjoying the podcast, take a minute to leave a rating wherever you like to listen to it, or share it with your friends on social media. Also, Benjamin and I are working engineers, and we love helping people turn ideas into finished productions. So if you're interested in working with one of us, or just want to discuss a project you're working on, reach out. You can find my work at calmfrogrecording.com, get me on Instagram at calmfrogrecording, or shoot me an email, vk@calmfrogrecording.com. And you can check Benjamin's work out at dreamloudstudio.com. Hit him up on Instagram at dreamloudstudio, or by email, ben@dreamloudstudio.com. And finally, join our Facebook group to engage with a whole group of friendly, like-minded people who are interested in DIY recording. Just search for DIY Recording Guys on Facebook. Thank you so much for listening and for your continued support. I'll see you next week.